It's your favorite NPC, and in this course I teach you everything you need to start using JavaScript for web development. You learn how to select, add, delete and manipulate HTML elements, react to events like button clicks or user input, use local storage, session storage and cookies to improve user experience and more. So let's go, guys! What is JavaScript? JavaScript is a programming language that runs directly in the browser. It allows websites to be dynamic and interactive. It works hand in hand with HTML for structure and CSS for design. But what can JavaScript actually do? It can react to user actions like clicks, typing or scrolling. It can change content and styles dynamically, validate forms, show pop-ups or even load new data, all without reloading the page. JavaScript is the most widely used language for web development and every modern browser supports it. Frameworks like React, Vue and Angular are all built on top of it, and with Node.js you can even use it on the backend. So in short, JavaScript is what brings your website to life. To understand how JavaScript works on the web, we first need to understand the DOM. When you write HTML code, it looks something like this, but JavaScript doesn't understand HTML directly. It's like HTML speaks German, while JavaScript only speaks English. So how can JavaScript interact with HTML code? The answer is the DOM. You can imagine the DOM as a tree structure that represents the entire HTML document and allows JavaScript to access, add or manipulate elements. In reality, the DOM is represented as a JavaScript object model provided by the browser. That object contains other objects, each representing another layer of the HTML document. For example, if you want to display a div inside your HTML file, JavaScript can add it directly to the DOM. Every time you change something in the DOM, the browser re-renders that part of the page. So the DOM is what will be displayed inside of the browser. So to sum up, the DOM acts as a bridge between your JavaScript code and your HTML structure, making your website truly interactive. To get started, let's create a basic index.html file and a basic template by using the exclamation mark. Now let's also create a script.js file and let's link the script.js file inside of our HTML file in the head. We can link our script file by using script:module. Now we need to define the source, which is script.js, and we need to set the def attribute because we're defining this inside of the head. And if we define the script tag inside of the head, we need to use defer, which tells the parser that this file right here should be parsed after the entire HTML and CSS code has been parsed. So this one should be parsed last. So how can we get a specific HTML element inside of JavaScript? First of all, let's create a div, for example, and we have a little bit of text in there. So how can we get a reference to this div container inside of JavaScript so we can later on, for example, change the content? In order to do so, we first of all can create a variable. This variable will store the reference to our div container in this case. And we can use any name we want to use. We could say div, for example. We could also say that or NPC. And in our case, let's just use NPC. So you see that actually anything works. We can now say that we want to get a reference to our document dot get element by tag name. And this one is going to be the right method for our purpose because we want to use the tag name to get a reference to this div right here. So we're going to use opening and closing brackets. And now we need to define the tag name. So what is the tag name of this div? The tag name is div. So we are going to say div right here. And now we can console.log npc right here, which is the variable name that we've defined for the reference to our tag name. We're going to go to our browser. You can see this is the text. And right here we have an HTML collection that holds this div right here that has a lot of data that we don't really need right now. And if I'm going to add another div instead of our index.html, or two more divs, you will see that we're going to get a bigger HTML collection. So now we have 3 divs inside of this collection. So the HTML tag name is an option, but as you can imagine, it's really hard to get a specific element right here. What if I wanted to get the second element, for example? And in order to do that, we can also use an ID, for example. So let's say we have a little bit of text right here, and now we have an ID, for example, that could be my minus text. Now we can also use this unique ID to fetch this paragraph. By saying, for example, const text is going to be equal to document, and now we can use get element by ID, and right in those brackets we need to define, in quotation marks again, the name of the ID that we've used for our paragraph right here. In our case, it's my minus text, so we're going to save that one. Now let's console.log our text, and you will see that this one works as well. So now we have a reference to our text, as you can see. There also exists the option to get a reference by class name. So now let's say this here is going to have a class of my minus second minus text. Let's copy that one. And now let's say const second text is going to be equal to document dot get element by class name, as you can see. And now we're just going to define, instead of quotation marks again, the class name. So my second text, for example. Let's save that one. Let's console.log our second text. And we are going to see in the console, we have this HTML collection again for our second text. So if we are using a class name, you already saw this one was a collection. So I can also add a lot of paragraphs right here, and our collection will just get bigger and bigger. So by using a class name, we can obviously get a lot of references because a class is not unique, whereas an ID is unique. So if you use an ID, you only get a single element. If you use a class, you can get a lot of elements. And now you can access the individual elements, for example, by using bracket notation and 0, for example, or the index of the element. So this works exactly as you would work with arrays, essentially. And now, as you can see, we are getting my second text right here. So the first one of those elements that has the class my minus second minus text. Now, let me delete all of this and let me show you that you can also use the query selector to achieve the same result by saying, for example, const text is going to be equal to document.querySelector. And as you can see, we have two methods for the query selector. We have query selector and query selector all. So if you only want to get one single element, so the first element that is found within the document that fulfills the requirements, then you're going to use query selector like so. Otherwise, you're going to use query selector all. And I'll show you the difference. If you're going to use query selector, you can access an ID, you can access a class, you can access a tag, and so on. If you want to access an ID, you're going to say hashtag. So we can, for example, say hashtag my minus text. So my minus text. And now let's console.log our text right here. And as you can see, we're getting this text right here in the console. Now we could also say we want to get dot my minus second minus text. So now we're getting a class by using the dot operator. And as you can see, we're getting my minus second minus class, but only one element this time because we used query selector and we did not use query selector all. So let me show you. If we use query selector all, we're getting all of those classes as a node list. So now we could, for example, access an individual text by using the index, for example, like so. So this one here should be the second item that has the index of 1. Now we can also use a tag, for example. So we can just say, let's get a p tag, for example. And again, we're getting this result. And now let me show you that this also outputs a lot of p tags. So I'm going to remove that one. And as you can see, we're again getting a node list. And we can also use query selector, which will only give us the first paragraph. So by using the query selector, you can get a class, an ID, or a tag name, doesn't really matter. If you use the get element by tag name, you can only define a tag name. If you're going to use get element by ID, you have to define an ID. And if you use get element by class name, then you have to define a class to get the element. So all of those methods work. There's not really one method that is the best one. It's in the end more about preference. So how can we change the input of a certain element? Let's, for example, imagine we have this paragraph right here. And this paragraph, for example, has the ID of text. So now we want to have some text input inside of this paragraph. In order to do so, we first need to get this paragraph. We can, for example, create a reference to our paragraph by saying const text is equal to document get element by ID. The ID name is text, so we need to define that one here. And now there are two methods to define text inside of this text element or inside of this paragraph, to be precise. We can, for example, say text dot text content is going to be equal to this is the best course, for example. Now we're going to save that one. And as you can see, now we have this text content in here. So this text inside of this paragraph. The other method would be dot inner HTML. And as you can see, we get the same result. And if I'm going to change that text right here by adding a DSDSA or whatever, we're also getting this effect. So you can see this works as well. So what is the difference between text content and inner HTML? If we're going to use inner HTML, we could also use italic, for example, or other HTML tags right here, and they will be interpreted. So I'm going to show you by using italic right here. And as you can see, now this text right here is italic. So this HTML text will be interpreted. If we're going to use text content though, I show you the difference. And as you can see, now we get this I tag right here. So this I tag will not be executed as HTML code. And what is the difference? Text content is a little bit safer and it prevents cross-site scripting, whereas in HTML obviously allows you to write HTML code inside of your text. But usually I definitely recommend you to use text content. As I already said, this is a lot safer. How can you get and set HTML attributes in JavaScript? Let's imagine we're going to have this link right here, and this one should redirect the user to Google, for example. So let's get the Google link right here, and let's copy and paste that one in here. So this anchor tag should redirect the user to Google. And as you can see, if we're going to click on this link, we're getting redirected to Google. So is there a way to get this attribute, for example? Let's give this element an ID of maybe Google. And now let's get a reference to that element instead of JavaScript by using const. And let's say this here's the link, for example. Now we're going to use document, get element by ID, and we're going to get our Google ID. And now let's, for example, just console.log link.get attribute. And we have to define the name of the attribute. In our case, the attribute name is href. So we want to get the href attribute of our link, which is this anchor link right here. Let's execute that one. And as you can see, we are getting the attribute right here instead of the console. Is there also a way to set a new attribute? And obviously there is. So you can also say link.set attribute. What kind of attribute do we want to set? Maybe in this case, we want to set the target attribute of our link. So this is the name of the attribute. And right next to the name, we also need to set the value for the attribute. And for our target, we could, for example, say that we want to use underline blank to open the page in a new tab. So we're going to save that one. Now we added for the link, the attribute target is equal to underline blank. So this is equal to doing target being equal to underline blank. So this is the exact same. Now we'll save that one. We are going to click this link, and as you can see, this link opens in a new tab. So we successfully added this attribute. So use the variable name that is a reference to your element, followed by get attribute to get an attribute, or followed by set attribute to set an attribute. Let me show you how you can use JavaScript to dynamically create HTML elements. Imagine we wanted to create an HTML element instead of this body right here. So we can go instead of JavaScript and we can say that we want to create a div. So let's say const div is equal to document.create element. So you use document.create element to create a new element. Now inside of the brackets, you need to define the tag name. What kind of element do we want to create? Let's say we want to create a div, for example. Now our div would essentially look like this, but it doesn't really have a place and it doesn't really have content yet. So we need to add content first. So let's add some content by saying div.text content is going to be equal to I am a div. We're going to save that one. So now we have this div, and this div also has text content, but this div will not be rendered yet on the HTML page because we're not telling it where it should be rendered. So we can, for example, get a reference to our body inside of our script file. So let's say const body is going to be equal to document get element by tag name, for example. And now let's just get the body. So now we have a reference to this body. And now we want to add our div element that we've created right here to this body element. So to this body. So we're essentially saying add this div to this body. And we can do so by saying body.append like so. And now we want to append an element. What kind of element do we want to append? We want to append our div element. So let's save that one. As you can see, we are not seeing anything because we need to say we want to get the first element from our body element because we said get elements by tag name. We get multiple elements. So this is an array and we need to get the first element right here. And as you can see, now we're getting this div. So to sum up, we are first of all getting the body. This here is going to be an array. We are going to access the first element inside of the array because there only exists a single body. Then we're going to use .append to append an element. We created this div right here, and then we append this div to our body element. And I can also show you in the console what is going on right here. If we go to elements, you can see we have this body right here. We selected this body using JavaScript, and then we said that we want to add this div right here to this body. So we want to append this div to this body, and that is what's going on right here. Now there's also the option to remove an element. So let's, for example, use set timeout. And let's say after a certain amount of time, so let's say, for example, after 5 seconds, we want to use body of 0 dot remove. We want to remove an element. What kind of element do we want to remove? We want to remove this div right here. So we're going to specify this div right here as well. We're going to reload the page. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now, as you can see, it is gone. So how can we use JavaScript to define styles for HTML elements? Let's imagine we are having this div right here. And let's say this div has an ID of container, for example. Now we want to get this container instead of JavaScript by saying const container is equal to document.get element by ID. And this one has the ID of container. So we're getting the element that has the ID of container. Now we want to style this container by using JavaScript. So we can say container. Now we can use .style, for example. And by using .style, we are saying we want to define or we want to have access to a CSS property. And right here, we have access to a lot of properties. So we can use bottom, for example. We can use left. We can also use background, for example. And in our case, let's say we want to use background. So let's say background is going to be equal to yellow, for example. Let's save that one. And as you can see, we're not seeing anything. And the reason for this is that we need a width and a height to set a background. So we can also say container.style.width is going to be equal to 100 pixels and container.style.height is going to be equal to 100 pixels. Let's save that one. And as you can see, we're getting this yellow square right here. So usually you can just use the reference variable followed by a .style to access a CSS property, followed by the name of the CSS property. And then you can just use normal CSS code inside of those quotation marks to define a property. Now you can also use JavaScript to add a CSS class or remove a CSS class from an element. So let's, for example, say we create a style.css file, and we're also going to link the style.css file inside of our HTML code, like so. So now all of this code is valid. And now let's, for example, create a class of blue, for example. So .blue. Now we're going to say that class has a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and a background of blue, for example. So now let's create another div right below. And let's say that div has the ID of blue minus container. Now we can grab this blue container right here instead of our script tag by saying const blue container is equal to document get element by ID. We're going to grab the blue container. And now let's say we wanted to add the class name to this container right here. So we want to add the class blue to this container by using code. And we can do so by saying blue container dot class list dot add. And now we can add the class, for example, blue minus container. Or in our case, actually the class is just blue. So that was my bad. So we have to add the class blue. Now we are ending the statement by using a semicolon. And now we added the class blue to this element right here by using JavaScript. And as you can see, we have this blue container. We can also go ahead and remove this class by using blue container.classlist.remove instead of .add. And we can also define the class in here. And as you can see, now we have removed the class. And something that is important when you work with buttons later on is the toggle method. So you can also say blue container.classlist.toggle, and then you can define the class. And this essentially means if you have a class of blue, you're going to remove this class. But if you don't have a class of blue yet, then you're going to add the class. And this is important if you think about a button click, for example, and if the user clicks on a button and the class does not exist yet, you want to add the class. But if the class exists, you want to remove the class. Let me introduce you to events in JavaScript. And a lot of people think events are super complicated, but essentially they are really, really easy. What is an event? The easiest way to really show you is by just creating a button. And this button will, for example, have a text that is click me, for example. And now this button will also have an ID of btn, for example. So we'll really keep this one simple. So what would be an event in this case? An event is pretty much anything that is happening on a page. An event can be a click, for example. An event can be you scrolling. An event can you be typing in input. So an event is essentially just anything that you do on the page. So actually an event can be anything. And you can decide which kind of event you want to grab instead of JavaScript and what you want to do when this event occurs. So we could, for example, say, okay, we want to react to a button click. And if we want to do something when a button click occurs, we have to add an event listener. So something listens to this event. Once this event happens, we are listening to the event and we can say, okay, now that this event occurred, we want to do something. In order to listen to an event, to a button event, for example, we first need to get a reference to the button. So we say const btn is equal to document get element by ID. We want to get our button. So now that we have a reference to this button right here, we need to add an event listener to this button because we want to say listen to all of the events that happen or to a specific event that happens for this button. So we can say button.add event listener. Now you have to use opening and closing brackets. This is a method. Instead of this method, you first have to define the type of event that you want to listen to. And there exist a lot of predefined types of events, and you just have to remember them essentially. But I'm also going to be honest, the most important event that you'll always use is going to be the click event. So we'll define the event by using opening and closing brackets. And here you can see a lot of events, but you won't really need any of those ones besides a few. So the click event, as I said, is really important. So we can define that we want to listen to a click event for this button, for example. So once the user clicks on this button, we want to do something. What do we want to do? That is the second argument. So this here's the listener. Once the user clicks on a button, we want to execute this callback function right here. And for example, we can just say we want to console.log clicked, for example. And obviously this logic right here can be a lot more complex, but let's just keep it simple to really understand what is going on. And as you can see, if we're going into the console right now, we can say click me. And as you can see, this one has been clicked right now. Also, something that's really important, you're also getting an event object every time you're adding an event listener. So you can get this one, but we don't really need it in this case, so I didn't specify it right here. But I just want to make sure that you know that this is possible. And we can also just say that we want to log this event right here once we click on this button. So we can, for example, now click on a button. And as you can see, we're getting this pointer event right here. But in our case, it does not make sense. But for the next thing that we want to do, it might make sense. So maybe we also want to track the user input in an input field. So we are going to say we want to create an input field of type text. This one has an ID, for example, of username. So let's pretend this here is the username. Now we're going to get a reference by saying const username is going to be equal to document.get element by ID of username. So now we have a reference to our username. And now we want to add an event listener to this username input field. And we want to see what kind of input the user types in there. Or we want to track that. So we say username.add event listener. In this scenario, we maybe want to listen to the input event because the user types in some input. And right here, we can actually say that we want to get the event or the event object, but I'm going to say this one here is E. And this is also a convention, so a lot of people say that this here is just E. And now we can also just say, let's add console.log, and let's just add our E, so our event. Now let's type some stuff in here, and as you can see, we're getting this input event. So now we have a lot of stuff in here. And something that you'll use very often is this target property right here. So e.target, for example. And as you can see, you have really a lot of properties in here. But one of the properties that is really important in there is the value property. But let me first of all show you e.target. So we'll access, instead of this object, the target property. And this target object has the value property. So now let's save that one. And now let me type something in. And as you can see, we're getting the value as an output in the console. Let me show you one more event that might be kind of important. So let's, for example, say we create a form of type post. And inside of this form, we are going to have a submit button. So button:submit. And usually when you press a button, so let's just say submit. And usually when you press a button, you will have a reload of the page. So take a look at the top right here. If I'm going to submit right here, you can see we're getting a reload and the page isn't working. So maybe this is something that you don't want to have, because this here is the default behavior of HTML elements. So we are going to grab this form by saying this one has an ID of form, for example. So let's keep it simple. And we're going to say const form is going to be equal to document get element by ID of form. Now we are getting our form. We are going to add an event listener by saying form.add event listener. What kind of event do we want to listen to? We want to listen to a submit event because right here the user is submitting data. So we are going to say submit is the event that we're looking for. We are again going to get our event object right here. And now if you want to prevent the default behavior of reloading, for example, you can use e.prevent default, which is a method, and we'll end that statement by using a semicolon. So now let me show you, once I press the submit button, nothing is happening. So now we could also say right here, console.log, we clicked, and we're going to go in here. And as you can see, we clicked will appear in the console, but we will prevent the default behavior of reloading the page once we submit, essentially. And that is something that is pretty useful, especially if you want to define all of your logic yourself instead of JavaScript, for example. So now we could also say that we want to create an alert, for example, that says, hey, yo, or wayo, doesn't really matter. Now we're going to click, and as you can see, we're getting this alert that has the message wayo, for example. So those are the most important events. I actually never really used a lot more myself. So I think if you know them, you're really good to go. But just keep in mind that there exist a lot more events, and maybe in the future you might need some, and then you can always go and take a look at the documentation. Let's understand set timeout and set interval. And those functions are actually super easy. Let's start by using set timeout like so. And by using set timeout, you're executing the method and it accepts a callback function. Inside of those brackets, you can define what you want to do when calling this method. So in our case, let's use a callback function right here. And right after the callback function, you can use a comma separated by a value right here. And this value defines in milliseconds how much time it will take to execute the method body inside of here. By saying 1000 right here, we say wait for 1000 milliseconds, so for 1 second, and after that second, execute the code that you have inside of this body right here. So we can, for example, just say console.log 1 second pass, for example. Let's save that code and let's execute that code by using run code. And as you can see, we're waiting and 1 second passed. Let me show you that this in fact works. I'm going to say this here executes after 2 seconds, and right here I'll say 2 seconds passed, and I'm also going to use 5 seconds so that we really see what is going on right here. So I'm going to execute the code once again, and as you can see, 1 second passed, 2 seconds passed, and 5 seconds passed. So set timeout is pretty simple. You just define what you want to do after a specific time right here, and after a comma, you define a time in milliseconds that you have to wait until you execute the code inside of the body. Set interval is pretty similar. The only difference is that you define an interval and you keep doing whatever you have in your method body forever. So let me show you. We're going to set interval. Again, we take a callback function right here. We can, for example, say console.log getting called every single second. So this line gets called every single second. And right now we also have to define a time, which can be 1 second, for example, in our case, because we want to call this function every single second. But obviously it's up to you what kind of time you're going to define right here. So now let's execute this code. And as you can see, getting called every single second gets called every single second, whereas the set timeout function only gets called 1 single time. In some cases, you might want to turn an object into a string. And a use case that you will often need is if you want to send data via the internet, or if you want to save data inside of the local storage of a user, for example. And the reason is, for example, if the user, for example, accesses your website like this, then you have the option to, for example, save something inside of the local storage of the user. And the local storage is essentially a storage that sits on the website of the user. So essentially you save the data in the browser of the user. And this can be especially useful if you think about a shopping cart, for example. So imagine we save the amount of items that the user has inside of the shopping cart. Then you maybe want to add the amount of items that the user has added to his cart, for example, to the local storage. So once the user quits the website and revisits the website, he still sees all of the items that he has inside of the cart, because it's obviously not the best user experience if the user quits your page, for example, and everything is gone. And in order to do so, we need to save something inside of the local storage, for example, but we can not save an object like this in the local storage. And in order to save this one, we need to create a string. And we can create this user string, for example, by saying that we want to use JSON.stringify like this, and then we pass our object inside of those brackets. We're going to save this, and now we're going to console.log our user string to really see what's going on here. And this here should be a string right now that we can send to the local storage, for example. Now let's imagine we want to have the original form again. Then we can say user original, for example, is equal to JSON.parse, and let's enter the user string, for example. And now let's also console.log right here our user original and we will just run this code again. And as you can see, this here is the original one. So we've parsed it and turned it into an object again. And this here is the stringified version. If you want to save the data to the local storage, for example, or send them by the internet, you can first use json.stringify. But if you know that you're going to receive one of those strings, you can use json.parse to turn them into the original form again. So if you say you want to receive this data and work with this data, then you turn this one into the original form again and can work with it. So you have the original object. And if you want to turn it or send it to the local storage, you can use json.stringify to stringify the object, for example. So let's say we saved the card of the user, for example, and inside of this card is essentially an object, we have an amount of items. So let's say he has bought 2 items or has added 2 items to his shopping cart at this point. And let's say this here is the amount. And then let's say the items, for example, are an array and we have some sneakers in there, for example, and some Jordans. So let's just say this represents a simple shopping cart of a user. And now we somehow want to make sure that once the user enters those items to the shopping cart, leaves the website and comes back to this website, the items are still in the shopping cart. Because it would be a probably pretty bad user experience if all of those items are gone. And we can do so by using the local storage. And let's take a look at the website. Once we inspect this website, we see that we can go to the application tab right here, and we can go to the local storage. And this here is the local storage, and we save key value pairs inside of the local storage. So this local storage is nothing that really has anything to do with a server, but rather is a storage on the PC inside of the browser of the user. So this local storage is not that big and it belongs to the browser of the user. So every time you want to save info like your shopping cart, for example, this is the way to do it. And especially if you think about a website where you, for example, don't need the user to be logged in and you don't want to query the database all of the time to get every single detail like the shopping cart, this would be the perfect opportunity to use the local storage. So let's say we want to save those items in local storage. And all I've done is essentially create this index.html and I've linked our index.js file to this index.html. So we are executing this JavaScript code that we are writing right here inside of the browser. So now let's say we're going to use the local storage, and there are 2 methods. The first one is set item and the second one is get item. And as the names imply, one is for setting the item in the local storage and the other one is for getting the item from the local storage. So you can set item, you first pass a key and you second pass a value. So this is the basic structure. So for our key, we could, for example, say, let's call this card items, for example. So I'm not going to name this one card because I want to show you that this is really, that you can really name this whatever you want. And then you have to pass in the value right here. So the value in our case is our card because we want to save our card to the local storage. So let's save this. Let's go inside of our browser. And as you can see now, we already have those card items inside of our saved to our local storage. But as you can see, the value is an object right now. And as I've mentioned in a previous episode, we cannot save an object to the local storage. And in order to save this card to the local storage, we have to turn it into a JSON string. So we are going to say json.stringify and we will pass this object to our json.stringify method. So now we're going to save this again. And as you can see, now we can read this value inside of our local storage. We have an amount of 2 and our items right here. Now let's also say we want to get those items from the local storage again and maybe console.log them. So let's now say local storage.get item. And once we want to get an item, we need to use the key. So we can say the key in our case is card minus items because that was the key that we've defined for our set items function. And now let's store those items. Let's say const card items is equal to local storage.get items. So now we can use those card items. So now we want to log those items, let's say in a console, for example. So we can say console.log and let's log our card items. Let's save this one. Let's go to our website and let's switch from our application tab to our console tab right here. And now as you can see, we get this item right here. But if we wanted to read those items inside of our console, we would actually need to use card items inside of a json.parse method. So we would have to enter them in here because first of all, we've created a string to save this inside of the local storage. But if we want to use this one as an object again inside of our JavaScript application, we have to parse this JSON string essentially. So let's console.log our card items and the parsed version. And as you can see, this here really looks like an object. the second one, the parsed version, whereas the first one looks like a JSON string. And is all you really need to know to understand the local storage in JavaScript. Let me show you the session storage. If you want to save an item to the session storage, you can use session storage.setItem. We can say that we want to set the username. As you can see, the username is going to be our key. This one is going to be a string. And now we can also say that we want to set a value right here. And let's say our username is Japo, for example. So we are going to save this one. We can go to the application tab. Right here, you can see that we have the local storage, for example, but we also have the session storage right here. If you open the session storage, you can see that we have the username of Japo. But nevertheless, what is the difference between the local storage and the session storage? The local storage will consist even if we refresh the page over a long time, while the session storage will get lost once we reload the page, for example, or switch to a different tab and so on. So the session storage is only available for one single session, and one single session goes up to the point where you leave the page or leave the tab. The local storage is usually available for a lot of sessions. So even if you go to a different page, for example, quit this page right here, open the page once again, and so on, you will still have the local storage, whereas the session storage is usually gone at this point. Let's understand cookies in JavaScript. Cookies are somewhat similar to sessions and the local storage, but they are also different, and understanding the difference is really important. So let's go to the application tab right here. And right here you can see we have, for example, the local storage, we have the session storage, and we also have the cookies right here. So we have the cookies for this URL, for example, as you can see. And now you can also clear the cookies. Now they're all gone. And as I've already mentioned, the local storage will be stored inside of the browser and will persist over many sessions. So even after reloading the session, the local storage will be there. The session, as the name implies, will persist over one single session. So every time you reload the page, for example, or go to a new tab, the session will be clear. Cookies, on the other hand, can also persist over many sessions, but the difference is that every time you send a request to your server, for example, and get a response, you also add this cookie to the request. So this is really good to authenticate the user, for example. So you can, for example, store a user ID inside of this cookie. You can send the request. If you want to get data, for example, the cookie will be automatically sent with this request. The server will see, okay, we have the user ID. So this is a valid user right now that is logged in, and I can reply with the data, for example. And it's also important to understand that usually if you want to save a user ID, for example, as a cookie, you don't do that via JavaScript, because that is something that should be handled using PHP. But you can also set data using JavaScript inside of a cookie, and that should obviously be data that is not that important, not that relevant. So we can set a cookie by saying document.cookie. Now we can set this to a string, for example. Right here, we can, for example, say that a monkey is equal to ayo. Now we can use a semicolon. Right here we also need to set an expiration date. So we can say expires is equal to, and right here we need to have a pretty long timestamp. And I actually can't really remember the syntax, and I don't recommend you to do this. So you can actually just generate a new date. So you can say const date is equal to new date. So we're going to create a date object. Now we can say date dot set date. We're going to set a date. We're going to say date dot get date. We're going to get the date of our date object that consists the current date. And now we can say, for example, that we want to add 7 to that date. So by using the syntax, we're saying add 7 days to the current date. So this date will be 7 days in the future right now. And now we can insert our variable right here into the string by using this syntax. And we can say date dot to UTC string, which will convert this string to the perfect format that we're going to need for this expires field right here. Now we also need to define a path, and that one can be equal to a slash, which means this cookie is valid for the entire website. Now let's save that one. We can go into the browser, we can refresh the page. Now as you can see, we have this cookie. It has a key or a name of monkey and a value of AO. If we want to get this cookie, we can, for example, say, let's console.log this cookie by saying document.cookie. So setting the cookie and getting the cookie has the exact same syntax right here. Let's go to our console. And as you can see, we are right here at the top getting monkey is equal to AO. If you wanted to delete the cookie, we could just go ahead, copy that line, for example, paste it in here. Now we can also update the date. So let's say we're going to use a different date. We're going to say date.setDate is date.getDate plus 7. Instead of plus 7, we are going to say minus 7, for example. This does not need to be minus 7, but it needs to be any point in the past. Because if a cookie expires in the past, it will be deleted. So we're going to do that one. We're going to set the cookie once again. And now let me console.log document.cookie right again. And this here should be the deleted cookie. So I'm going to add that one as well. We're going to console.log that. We're going to reload our page. And as you can see, we're only getting the line deleted cookie, but we're not getting any information right after because the cookie is now deleted. We can also take a look at this in the application tab. If we take a look at the cookies tab, we are not having any cookies anymore because the cookie is deleted. Let me introduce you to the window, document, navigator, and location object. In order to do so, I think it makes sense to console.log our window object. Now let's go into the browser, inspect, and in the console we can see that we're getting this window object right here, which includes a lot of stuff. It includes the history, it includes the document, it includes alert, and so on. So the window document is essentially what represents your window. And this window object includes everything. So we could, for example, say, let's get window.innerHeight. And by doing so, we will get the inner height, so the height of this window right here. And as you can see, the height right now is 910 pixels. We can also get the inner width, for example. So let's save that one. And as you can see, the width is 1331 pixels. If I'm going to make this one a little bit smaller by making the console bigger, and I'm going to reload, you can see now it only has a width of 1143 pixels. So this might be kind of useful from time to time. Now you also have the document object. As you can see, let's log that one. We have this document object right here, which you also use pretty often, if you remember, by saying document.getElementById. So you can use that one, for example, to get elements from the DOM by their ID, for example, by their class name, by their tag name, and so on. So this is pretty useful about the document. You can also say that you want to add an event listener, for example, to the document. Let's listen to click events. And we're going to console.log clicked once we clicked the document. So let's see what is the document. I'm going to click in here, and as you can see, pretty much everything is the document. So the document represents your HTML website. So the window includes everything. The document includes your HTML website. Now let's use the navigator. The navigator gives you a lot of information about connection, for example, about the device, and so on. In my opinion, it's not that important, but I want to show it to you very quick. So you can, for example, say navigator.online, and now we can just console.log that one. So you see what is going on right here. And as you can see, we're getting true inside of the console. What is navigator.online for? This one checks whether you have an internet connection right now. If you have an internet connection, this will return true. Otherwise, it will return false. And now let me also show you the location object. So first of all, let's console.log location, for example, .href, and let's go into the browser. And as you can see, we're getting this website right here. So we're getting the current URL. So location in general is an object that includes information about the current location, as you can see. And you can, for example, access the host name, the host, the path name, the port, and so on. But most of the time you want to use href because that is the complete path to your current page. So if you wanted to change the page, for example, you could say location.href is going to be equal, and now we can say slash, which means we're going to use the default host right here. And after the host, we want to say contact.html, for example. So once we get to the index.html page, we are loading this script.js file right here. Once we load the script.js file, we're saying, okay, now navigate the user to our /contact.html page. I'm going to reload the page. And once I go into the browser, you can see that we cannot get the contact.html file because we don't have that file now. But if you take a look at the URL, you see that this in fact did work because we now navigated to our contact.html URL. And if we would have a contact.html, like so, for example, and I would say wayo, for example, or whatever, you can see that this one works. Now, if I'm going to go to our index.html file, I get redirected to our contact.html immediately because we run the script file. Let me introduce you to alert, prompt, and confirm. Let's start by using confirm, for example. So I'm going to say confirm, are you above 18, for example. I'm going to save that one. Let's load our index.html file right here. As you can see, once we get to the index.html file, we are getting this notification that asks whether I'm above 18 or not. So let's press OK right here. And as you can see, the notification disappeared. But maybe we want to get that value. So we can, for example, say const age is equal to this confirm message. And now just console.log the age value to see how this one looks. So we're going to press OK. And as you can see, we're now getting true. So you could use this one, for example, to check whether the user is 18. If he isn't 18, you can deny access to the page. And if he is 18, you can grant access to the page. So this would be a possible scenario. Now, there also exists the prompt mechanism, like so. And now you can, for example, ask, what is your name? And in this case, username might be a more descriptive variable name. So let's do that. And as you can see, we get this input right here where we can enter a name, for example. So I can say I'm Peter, for example. I saved that one, and as you can see, nothing really happened. But let's console.log our username to see whether we really got this value right here. Username, like so. And let's say I'm an NPC, for example. And now, as you can see, we're getting this value right here. So can we use this value now? Obviously we can, but we could also use it with an alert, for example. So let's now test an alert and say, hello. And now we're going to add our username that we've just gotten by using this prompt right here. So we're getting this prompt. We can say I'm an NPC. I'm going to press OK. And now we're getting this alert right here, which says hello NPC. So the first one was a prompt and the second one was an alert. Let me introduce you to the history in JavaScript. Imagine we are having this HTML file and we have an H1 right here, for example, that says this is, or that just says home, for example. And now we also have two more pages, like a contact.html and an about.html. Let's create a basic template and let's say this one here is about and this one here is our contact, like so. And now let's also create a short navigation bar. So we have an anchor right here that redirects the user to our home or index.html file. This here is home. Let's duplicate that one. This here is going to be contact and this here is going to be about. Doesn't really matter too much though. So this is contact and this is about. And now let's just copy those anchor tags right here and paste them on our about page and on our index.html page. And as you can see, now we have this navigation. We have home, contact, and about. And about somehow does not seem to have the anchors for whatever. Okay, now it works. So now maybe we want to use JavaScript to navigate on our page. So we can, for example, say on our index.html file, let's create a button that has the ID button, for example. And that one says, click me. We're going to get this button inside of JavaScript by using const btn is equal to document get element by ID btn. And now we want to do something once the user clicks on this button. How can we do something? We are going to add an event listener. We are going to listen to the click event. Once the user clicks on the button, let's, for example, say we just want to log our history, because that is ultimately what we need to redirect the user on a button click. So let's first take a look at that. Let's go to our homepage. We have this button right here. And as you can see, now we're getting this history object right here. And you can see we have a lot of properties right here, like back, forward, go, push state, replace state, and so on. And the most important ones, in my opinion, are back, forward, and go. And as the names imply, back goes backward, forward goes forward, and go allows you to be more precise. For example, if we click this button, let's say we want to use history.back. So we're getting back to the previous page that we visited. So we're going to go to contact. From contact, let's go back to home. So now our previous page was contact. We're going to click this button. And as you can see, we are getting redirected to the contact page. Now let's use forward, for example. And forward is a little bit tricky. So let me show you. We're going to contact, home, click me, nothing happens. Why doesn't anything happen? Well, because this is our newest page, since we never went back. So we have to go back in order to be able to use this button right here to jump forward. So now let's test that. Let's go from our home page to our contact page. Now let's go backward. So now we went back to our home page, and the next page would again be our contact page because that was the page where we pressed back. So now let's click this button and we're getting redirected to the contact page. Also, if we would go to the home page, go to about, then we're going back. We're now again on the home page, but we press the back button on the about page. So that one would be the page if we go forward. So let's click that button, and as you can see, we're now on the about page. And now you can also use go, for example. And go is pretty simple. You just enter a value, so a number. Do you want to go forward? Maybe you want to go one page forward, then we use 1. Maybe you want to go one page backward, then we use -1. Maybe you want to go 2 pages backwards, then we use -2, for example. So this is really simple. Now let's test that one. Let's click on contact. Let's click on about, and let's go to home, click me, and as you can see, we're landing on the contact page. Why the contact page? Because that was the page where we have been 2 clicks ago. So let me show you. We're starting at the home page. First click, contact page. Second click, about us page. Third click, home page. So if I'm going to click right here now, we're going to go 1 level back, about, 2 levels back, contact. So we should land on a contact page. And as you can see, we land on a contact page.